story of Joni Lamb's memorial service is not just a story about one woman's death. It is a story about love, about legacy, about the complicated, messy, heartbreaking, and ultimately beautiful truth of what it means to be a mother, a wife, a builder, and a person of faith, all at the same time. So let's start from the beginning. If you don't know who Joni Lamb was, I need you to understand the scale of who we're talking about. Joni was the co-founder and president of the Daystar television network, one of the largest Christian broadcasting networks on the entire planet. She built that network from nothing alongside her first husband, Marcus Lamb, starting back in the 1980s when the two of them were just a young married couple driving from church to church as traveling evangelists with a dream and a whole lot of faith. By the time she passed away on May 7, 2026, at just 65 years old, Daystar was broadcasting into hundreds of millions of homes worldwide, hundreds of channels, a global operation, and Joni was right there at the center of it. As executive producer, author, singer, and the beloved host of Joni Table Talk, the daily roundtable show that her viewers watched like clockwork, that was nominated for a Daytime Emmy, and that was syndicated not just on Christian networks, but on ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, and Lifetime. That's how big she was. Her life had been full of joy and full of storms. She and Marcus had built something extraordinary together, raised 3 children, Jonathan, Rachel, and Rebecca, and weathered the kind of challenges that would have broken most people. A public marital affair, the brutal grief of losing a life partner, the weight of running a global ministry as a solo leader. And then, in 2023, she found love again. She married Dr. Doug Weiss, a Christian psychologist who she said was like a refreshing rain after a drought in her soul. And then, quietly, she started battling health issues she chose to keep private. A back injury made everything worse, and her condition declined rapidly in her final days. She passed away at home in Bedford, Texas, on May 7, 2026. Now, that's the backdrop, that's who Joni Lamb was, and that's what makes what happened on May 18, 2026, so extraordinary. On that Monday, 11 days after her passing, a crowd gathered at Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas, one of the largest and most well-known churches in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, to celebrate her life. And honey, when I say it was a significant gathering, I am underselling it. The service was led by Pastor Jentezin Franklin, a well-known figure in evangelical Christian circles. The speakers included Joel Osteen, Samuel Rodriguez, Jonathan Cahn, Paula White Cain, and, are you ready for this? President Donald Trump, and a video message from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. For a woman who started her career as a traveling evangelist, hitting small churches across the South, this is remarkable. This is what 40-plus years of faithful, dedicated ministry looks like. This is what happens when you spend your whole life pouring into people, and then they all show up, from all over the world, to pour right back. But listen, I don't want to get too caught up in the famous names, because the moments that will stay with you from this memorial service are not the political speeches. They are the words spoken by the people who knew Joni Lamb most intimately, the people who called her mom, the man who called her baby. Let's start with Doug. Doug Weiss, Joni's husband of 3 years, gave his tribute by video. He explained that the team had asked him to pre-record it, and if you think about why, it makes complete sense. This man was not going to hold himself together at that podium in front of a crowd, and he knew it. And in his own words, he said to everyone watching, "She's worth every tear." He talked about how he knew her not as Joni Lamb the broadcaster, not as the co-founder of Daystar, not as the singer or the author or the television personality. He knew her as his wife, his partner, the woman whose hand he took when they got married, and whose hand he was still holding at the very end. He described their life together with such tender, simple detail: the whitewater rafting trips, the biking, the walks on the beach, holding hands like any ordinary couple. He said they met with presidents and distinguished people all over the world, but what mattered most to him was that they kept their word to each other, that they stayed lovers, through everything. And then he described her final moments. He said, and I want you to really hear this. As the last moments of her life were leaving her body, I stood there holding her hand as she grabbed Heaven's hand, and she left this world. He was holding her hand, she was holding Heaven's hand, and that image, I don't know what to do with that, except feel it. He also acknowledged, gently but clearly, that there had been external challenges in Joni's final years that had taken a toll on her health. He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew what he was referring to. The public family battles, the allegations, the pain of a family torn apart, and he made it clear that those external challenges had been a real factor in what happened to her body. But he didn't dwell there. He ended with something beautiful and pastoral, the counselor in him reaching out to every person in that room who was grieving. He said, "Feel your feelings, cry your tears, hug those around you, and take the hand of Jesus and let him hold it as you go through this." That is a man who loved his wife and who, even in his deepest grief, was still thinking about everyone else in the room. Joni clearly had a type. She was drawn to people whose love showed up in how they treated others. And then her daughter Rachel took the stage. Rachel Lamb Brown is Joni's eldest daughter, and she has been part of the Daystar family her whole life. A host, a marketer, a woman who grew up in the middle of everything her parents built, and standing up there, having already lost her father Marcus, just 4 years earlier, she looked out at that crowd and said what so many people in that room were probably feeling, that it was unimaginable to be standing there again, that none of them expected things to happen as fast as they did. She said, with such love, "I hate that she had to walk so much of this journey privately, especially when she loves sharing so much of her life with all of you." And she explained why she believed her mother made that choice. She said Joni had to make sure that in a world that always had so much to say, the loudest voice she heard was the Lord's. She was protecting her peace. She was choosing where to put her attention. And then Rachel said something that stopped me cold. She talked about these last 2 years, the hard years, the years of family conflict and public scrutiny, and she said, "I watched my mom boldly stand on truth, and I will never forget the way she covered me during the hardest season of my life. She walked with me, she spoke life over me, she prayed with me, and she held me together when it felt like my whole world was falling apart. When my heart wanted to become hard, she would continually remind me to keep it soft." Oh wow, I want you to think about what it means for a daughter to say that about her mother, especially a mother who was in the middle of her own battle, her own health crisis, her own family heartbreak, her own public scrutiny. Joni Lamb, in the last 2 years of her life, was carrying enormous weight. And yet Rachel is standing there saying, in the middle of all of that, she was the one holding me up. She never stopped being my mom first. Rachel also shared a story that just wrecked me in the best possible way. She described a moment when Joni was preparing for a medical procedure, facing her own very uncertain health situation, not knowing what the future held. And what did Joni do in that moment? She shared the gospel with her doctor, right there, before they even started. And that doctor, according to Rachel, rededicated his life to the Lord. And he was in the room at the memorial service that day. I mean, even on the way into surgery, Joni Lamb was thinking about someone else's eternity. That tells you everything you need to know about who this woman was at her absolute core. Rachel closed by saying, no matter what she was facing, she still showed up. She kept loving people. She kept pouring into others. She kept pointing people to Jesus. And I was amazed by her strength. Even when her body became weak, her spirit never was. Then came Joni's younger daughter, Rebecca Lamb Weiss, who was married to a man named Jonathan Weiss, no relation to her stepfather, Doug Weiss, which, I know, is a lot of Weisses for one family. And she talked about her mother's most extraordinary gift. She said, one of the things Mom was best at was making others feel valued and loved. She had a way of connecting with people and making them feel like family. And then she said something that I think perfectly captures why Joni's audience was so loyal and so devoted for so many decades. Rebecca said, when Mom passed, there was such an overwhelming amount of comments that came in where people said, your mom felt like my friend. And that's why it translated across the screen. The love that she had was real. Think about that. Joni Lamb was broadcasting to hundreds of millions of homes. She was reaching audiences on every continent, and people came away from watching her feeling like she was their friend, not a celebrity, not a televangelist, their friend. Because she wasn't performing love, she actually had it, and it came through the screen. Rebecca also said something that really stuck with me, that her mother never ministered from a place of looking down at someone. She always met people right where they were, heart to heart, because that's the kind of person she was. And Rebecca called her mother a gifted interviewer and storyteller, someone with what she described as an anointing for drawing the story out of people. Joni understood the power of a testimony, her daughter said. She understood that nothing is more powerful than someone's personal story of how Jesus changed their life. And she platformed those stories over and over for decades because she wanted the world to hear them. Rebecca also said something that I want to sit with for just a moment. Another thing I loved about Mom is she was never really telling stories about herself. She was always telling other people's stories, because Mom never wanted to make things about herself. For someone who built such a massive public platform, who had her name on a television show that ran 5 days a week for decades, she never wanted to make it about herself. That is an extraordinary kind of humility, and I think it's the secret ingredient to why people loved her the way they did. Now, there is one more person I need to tell you about. And this part of the story is the one that sits quietly but heavily over the whole memorial service. Jonathan Lamb, Joni's only son, who had been estranged from her in the final years of her life over deeply painful family disputes, did not give a speech at the service. But he was there. He and his wife Susie were in attendance, quietly, away from the cameras, separated from the rest of the family in the crowd. And Jonathan honored his mother with a social media post. I want to be gentle here, because there is real pain on every side of the story. Jonathan and Joni had very publicly clashed in the years before her death. He had made serious allegations involving the family. He had been let go from his position at Daystar. There were public statements, recorded board meetings. The whole painful thing played out in front of the Christian media world. And yet, on the day of his mother's memorial service, he was there, sitting in that room, grieving his mother. Because underneath every complicated family story, underneath every public battle and broken relationship, there is still a child who loved their parent. Still a person who is now walking through loss. The fact that he was there, even off to the side, even away from the cameras, says something. Grief has a way of cutting through everything else and reminding you what mattered. And his mother mattered. Whatever else was true, she was his mother. Pastor Jentizen Franklin, who led the service, opened by reminding everyone of what Joni herself would have wanted them to hold on to, that she was with Jesus, that she had heard the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And you know what? I believe that. I believe that someone who lived the way Joni Lamb lived, who showed up even on the way into surgery to share her faith, who kept her heart soft when it would have been so much easier to let it harden, who chose love over and over again even when she was carrying enormous private pain. Yes, I believe she heard those words. Joni Lamb was 65 years old. She was a wife, twice over, a mother of 3, a grandmother of 7, the founder of a global Christian television network, a singer, an author, a daily presence in the lives of millions of people who turned on the TV and felt like they were sitting down with a friend. She was not perfect. Her life had real controversy and real heartbreak and real complicated family stuff that didn't get neatly resolved before she left. But she was real. She was faithful. She kept showing up. She kept the faith even when the faith was being tested by everything life threw at her. And in the end, what her daughters remembered most wasn't the empire she built. It was the way she held them when their worlds fell apart. The way she reminded them to keep their hearts soft. The way she prayed with them. The way she walked beside them. That's the legacy of Joni Lamb. Not just the television network, not just the Daytime Emmy nomination or the global reach or the famous people who showed up to say goodbye. It's the soft-heartedness she passed down to her daughters, the love that came through the screen and made millions of strangers feel like family, and the image of a woman holding her husband's hand and reaching for heaven at the very same moment.